Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Just give us a minute or two. Welcome to everyone. We are expecting a pretty large audience today, maybe up to 300 people. So just give us a minute while we allow some additional colleagues and folks to join.
It is awesome to see everyone joining. So, like Janice said, give us a couple more minutes and we'll get started. Thank you for those who are sharing in the chat their names and where they're from. It's awesome to see people from all over the place. Thank you. All different states. Since we have a lot of content to go over today, I am going to get started with a couple first intro slides. So welcome. Thank you everybody for joining. My name is Christina Rosari, and it's my privilege to welcome you to our event on person-centered recovery planning. This is our second webinar in a series of 6, jointly hosted by Region 1 New England MHTTC and Region 6 South-Southwest MHTTC. So let's dive in some introduction information and get started. Next slide, Janice or Amanda. Here's a brief acknowledgement. So today's session is made possible through our funder support SAMHSA. The views expressed by our speakers are their own and not necessarily reflected of the position of SAMHSA. MHTTC Network provides free training, technical assistance, and resources to enhance mental health workforce. Check out our map, and you will find your region's MHTTC to access valuable training products, resources that are tailored to your area. The MHTTC network prioritizes affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language. This focus is especially crucial in our person-centered recovery planning. We encourage you to join in reflecting our language that is strength-based and recovery-oriented through our series. And we have some housekeeping items here, as you can see. We have we're happy that everyone's here today. Attendees are able to unmute and share. If you have questions, please post them in the chat for everyone to see. Do not send messages directly to the presenters, as they would like to share answers in a group. This session is recorded, and then you will get a confirmation email with a link for your CEUs after this training. Please know that you have to participate in the full session to be able to get your CEUs. And the registers are responsible for checking their licensing or credential board to ensure the acceptance of the CEUs. And without further ado, I want to pass it along to Janice and Amanda.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here, and a pleasure to hopefully actually welcome back some of you who may have joined us for our first webinar that we hosted a few weeks ago. My name is Janice Tondora. I use she, her, hers pronouns. Just to give you a little bit about background in terms of some of the experiences that I bring to today's conversation. From a professional perspective, I am a clinical psychologist by training. I'm on the faculty at a place called the Yale Program for Recovery and Community Health. And what I have really dedicated my career to at that Yale Perch program is trying to take the concepts of recovery oriented care around what it means to be strengths-based, person-centered, promote self-determination. A lot of times terms like that float around in the abstract. And what I have really dedicated my career to is trying to translate those concepts and values into concrete practices and different ways of working differently with people in the field. So you can read a little bit more about my background, the kinds of activities that I'm involved in there. But from a personal perspective, I'm also a loving mom of a young adult who has struggled pretty mightily with mental health concerns, and also a loving daughter of a parent who had struggled for many years with substance use concerns. So I have seen the value of good person-centered care and planning when it works well, but also have seen really the harm that can be done in instances where we're not staying true to those values. So bring a lot of passion to this topic, as does my colleague Amanda Bowman, and I'm going to turn it over to her to say hello.
Hey everybody, my name is Amanda Bowman, and I'll just touch on some highlights to let you know what I bring to these conversations today. So I have been identifying as a clinical social worker, bringing her personal lived experience to this work for a while now. It got me into the field of social work, similar to what Janice was talking about. I experienced a life disruption due to mental health challenges as a young adult, and experienced both helpful and unhelpful recovery planning. And that sort of lit a fire under me to get involved with the work in a way that I felt passionate about. I have over a decade of experience doing clinical work. Ended up kind of getting sucked into more administrative leadership and systems change work, which I didn't expect to get involved in. But you start to kind of see things that are broken and speak out, and before you know it, you're involved in more, mid-level systems work and policy level work. And that has become a passion of mine. And for the last decade or so, I've had the privilege of doing training and consulting and providing support to different leaders across the US at provider organizations who are looking to make meaningful change at the program level or at the systems level. So I'm honored to be here with you today and see if we can make this next 90 minutes something that is helpful to you, and really, start some conversations for you to think maybe a little differently about your work, or help you advocate for some things that maybe you want to spark some change in people around you. So let's get a sense. I appreciate all the hellos in the chat. We do want to take a quick poll of who we have here today. So the same information that you see on the slide, we have in a poll form. Christine, if you would launch our poll, great. If everybody would check all of the roles that apply to you, you don't have to select just one. And we have a number of polls today to try to make this quick little session as interactive as we can. So if everybody would take a minute, if we can, and then we'll share what the group looks like, not just who registered, but who actually was able to make it today. It's like we've got about 40%, 50%. Give everybody another couple seconds here. And if there is a role that was not captured here, if you don't mind maybe putting that in the chat box for us. We'd love to make sure that we've got all the different kinds of work represented so that we can try to speak to the different roles as much as possible in our short amount of time, because we've also got some short answers. Okay, Christine, I think we can probably end it and share the results so far with everybody. Okay, if you want to take a minute and just look at where you fall within the group today. It looks like we've got a pretty nice distribution of roles here today, which is excellent. Okay, thank you. We can stop sharing that, I think. Excellent. All right. Another little quick thing we wanted to share. This is the final schedule for our upcoming sessions. So if you were able to attend the last webinar, one of the things that we did is we shared the different ideas for topics that we had, and we elicited some feedback. And you can see those results on the right. We had lots more topics than what we had, slots for. It was very painful for Janice and me. But you can see there on the left is our final schedule. And you will get a follow-up email after today with a link to register for upcoming sessions. But I'm also going to drop that link in the chat box right now. It looks like it turned out a little funky. It put two things in the chat, but one of them is going to be useful. So click the one that brings you to the site if that's what you're looking for. The next one coming up is on May 15th, and that's going to be looking at peer specialist roles and person-centered recovery planning. I'm really excited about that because we're going to be talking about ethics and values and how it really does support a person-centered approach to planning, specifically in clinical provider organizations. So hopefully you can join us for that if you're interested. If you weren't able to attend our last session, part of what you missed is an overview of the program series, but also we really tried to provide clarity on exactly what person-centered recovery planning is and is not, because those words get tossed around a lot. And a recording of that session is available online at the link that I provided and a link that will be in the follow-up email. And we really want that information to serve as a foundation and an introduction to the practice. But Janice now is going to spend about 10 minutes or so talking a little bit more about some of the foundational understanding of what PCRP is, and really making sure that we're always linking back to the process, the purpose, and the relationships, because we really can't dive in to creating the plan document without linking back to those important points. So I am going to advance the slide here for you, Janice.
Great. Thanks, Amanda.
Yep.
So, as you heard Amanda allude to, and for those of you that actually were able to join us a few weeks ago, we introduced this overarching model of the 4P component parts of person-centered recovery planning that really have to work together in synergy to actualize this practice with integrity in the field. And so we spent a lot of time talking in our first session about the philosophy and the process, and we covered some core competencies in what that looked like in the relationship and engagement strategies. But we also talked about the fact that sometimes one of the places that the quality of the person-centeredness breaks down in the overarching model is making that leap from the green part of the pyramid to the golden part of the pyramid. And sometimes even when we carry person-centered philosophy in our hearts and we're enacting it in our relationships, when we go to then try to translate that into an actual person-centered plan, be it on paper or an EHR, that can be a real struggle. And then, as Amanda alluded to, we had done our priority topics full. It was very clear from the feedback that we got that this is a source of much confusion in the field. So while we are going to be focusing primarily on that topic today and addressing some of the confusion and the mixed messages that are out there, we really wanted to be very intentional in reminding folks that no matter how good the plan looks on paper, it's never an automatic proxy for the person or the family's experience, right? Because it has to be based authentically on that quality person-centered process and relationship, with that, foundation really being that foundation of mutual respect that then informs the development and the co-creation of the plan. So to that end, if you have not joined us previously, just really encourage you. We provided a nice resource tip sheet the first time that we met, which is called Tips for Recognizing Person-Centered Process. So talking about different ways of having conversation, different kinds of supports, different ways of engaging people. And as Amanda mentioned, and there was a link in the chat box, but also when you get the slides, there'll be a link here as well. There's a whole set of key foundational person-centered processes that really need to come before you pick up pen and put it to paper or start stroking those keypads in the computer developing a plan. So we covered a lot of this territory in our first webinar, and some of these key processes really were focused around everything ranging from the practical in terms of the logistics and making sure that people have, reasonable control around advance notice and who is involved in that process and when it happens and what it might actually look like in terms of facilitation. And then also really keeping in mind that it has to be based on certain fundamental premises and seeing things like community inclusion and self-determination, not as something that a person has to earn through compliance or clinical stability, but at its foundation, those are really kind of human rights that people should experience in care. So again, if you have not had an opportunity and did not join us, please do check out that initial webinar, because it really provides the foundation for what we're going to be talking about today. So before we dive into that in detail, I want to talk a little bit about some of the barriers that prevent us from making the leap from good person-centered process to a good person-centered plan. And one of the most common barriers that we encounter is this assumption that we already do it, that we're already doing and writing person-centered plans. And while there's a tremendous amount of progress that we have seen in the field in recent years, there's also kind of a ways that we have to go. So I'm just going to invite you to pretty actively use your chat box here and answer a few questions for me for a few minutes, just to illustrate some of those points around, again, what we're doing well, but where we maybe need to make some improvements. So my first question for all of you, I'm going to give you permission to take off your recovery hats for a moment, take off your person-centered hats. And I want you to think about, how do we traditionally define improvement in behavioral health treatment systems? What do we traditionally value as outcomes for people who are living with experiences of mental illness and substance use concerns? Traditionally, what do we traditionally value and focus on? Go ahead and use the chat box. And start putting some things in the chat box. Great. Yeah, adherence, medication compliance, reduced symptomatology, staying out of the hospital, remaining abstinence, number of appointments that you're keeping. Maybe being more self-sufficient, adherence. A lot of votes coming in around adherence and compliance. Stability, fewer crises. We don't want people to go to the hospital. Where else don't we want people to go? We don't want them to end up where? Yeah, involved with the criminal justice system, jail, on the streets. Okay, good. So here, I want you to hit the pause button for a moment. And I want you to think about another question. And now I want you to take off your professional hats and I want you to think about yourself as a human being. And I just want you to spontaneously put down in the chat box 3 things that are most important to you in your own life personally. 3 things that give your life meaning, the reason you get out of bed in the morning, whatever it might be. I invite you to put 3 things into the chat box. So I'll give you a few minutes to do that. Kids, family, love, my dogs. I often say they fit in the family category. Spirituality, however I experience that, being a mom. We've got some votes for the felines out there, the cats. Having a sense of meaning, relationships, connectedness, spending time with my grandchildren. Freedom, having freedom to choose, okay? All right, so first, thank you for doing that. You can kind of keep them coming in. What I wanna illustrate here is think about when I asked you to identify historically, what do we value in traditional treatment systems? What do we value as outcomes? What do we tend to focus on in service planning? We got a list that looked a lot like the list on the left. But then when I asked you to think about, as a human being, what gives your life meaning, right? And what's the reason that you get out of bed in the morning? We got a list that looked a lot more like the list on the right, okay? We would argue that these are very, very different lists. And they're, reflecting some of the shifts that we have to make. Some people have described the distinction between these 2 lists, that on the left-hand side might be what we think is important for people, right? That we're serving, it's what's important for them to do. But on the right side is what is important to them in their lives and in their recovery, right? Another way to think about this is the left-hand side of the list is about surviving, and the right-hand side of the list is really about thriving, right? So last quick question for you. I just want you to imagine in your minds for a moment, you put 3 things in the chat box, and just imagine that I am crossing off the middle thing on that list and taking it out of your life for even a temporary period of time. And I just want you to sit with that for a minute and just think about what that would feel like to have that thing taken out of your life. Some of you may be feeling hopeless. You may be feeling like you've lost your sense of meaning, depressed, life's not worth living. Some of you might be angry at me for taking that off your list. And so what I want you to think about as we move forward in the session today is that despite all the progress that we have made around recovery-oriented practice and person-centered planning, people who receive services do often say that service planning can feel like an experience where someone else in the room other than them has the power to decide what 2 things end up on the list and what 1 thing gets crossed off or deferred, okay? So to be very clear, we don't believe that anyone on today's webinar goes into this business to cross anything off of people's lists. There's very complex dynamics that have to do with everything from attitudes to systems logistics to how services are paid for. But nonetheless, it's important to start with that visceral sense of what it feels like for people to not have control over some of these things in their lives. And to give very real concrete examples, if a person really wants to be a good provider, and just like you put into the chat box, I want to have a job that gives me a sense of purpose. I want to have a job that helps me to be the best provider I can be for my family. If they're in a planning meeting and they hear the messages, we know that's important to you, but first you've got to do 90 meetings in 90 days before we will sign off on your referral to supported employment. That's the equivalent of their employment goal being crossed off their plan. Or a person who's maybe living in a residential 24/7 group home type setting. And they say, before I die, I just want a key to my own apartment. I want my own place. I want to build my nest. And if that person is sitting in a service planning conversation with an individual or a team, and they're getting messages around, we know that's important to you, we're going to get there eventually, but until we have 6 months of medication compliance, the team is not comfortable supporting that transition. So in that moment, sort of a home of one's own is taken off the plan, and the things that we think are important for that person are placed on the plan. So we just want you to sit with that as we kind of go through the session today. So this assumption that we already do it is a significant barrier to its implementation. And really what we need to be doing is thinking about how do we kind of get beyond this us and them mentality, because people want basically the same things out of life that all of us do, and the same kinds of things that you all just put in the chat box that give your lives personal meaning. So I'm not going to actually show this video, but it is a very powerful video that talks about how this foundation of good person-centered process and mutual respect, it looks and feels different for people in very powerful ways that becomes a nice foundation for co-creating the plan. So when you get the slides, I would just encourage you to check it out. It's one of our favorites that we like to share. So here's an additional barrier that we hear a lot. Amanda and I hear this a lot in our travels where we're doing this work, that I may believe in this in my heart and I may maintain person-centered relationships with people, but when I actually go to create the plan of care, I get caught between a rock and a hard place and squeezed between what feel like these competing tensions up here on the screen, right? On the one hand, we're talking about maximizing collaboration and focusing on strengths and practicing transparency. But yet on the other side, we have people who are sometimes chasing us around with red pens and looking in our charts and getting us ready for audits. And we feel a lot of pressure around the required paperwork, the regulations, on the billing and compliance pressures, and weaving that golden thread of medical necessity in the documentation. And many people feel when they get squeezed like this, they don't see a vision for how you can integrate in the context of one good quality plan. So what we plan to do today is we want to walk it through with an example and hopefully leave you with a more optimistic vision that you can absolutely co-create a plan with a person that first and foremost honors them and what's most important in their recovery vision, without compromising the necessary rigor that we understand you need in your documentation, okay? So we just want to introduce you. We're going to call this person Jerry. Jerry's a 42-year-old single white man. He's living with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Despite having really good connections in his treatment system and his personal life, he's experienced a number of very lengthy hospitalizations. And when he is in the community, often lives in very heavily supported 24/7 type group home environments. Jerry had a lot of strengths that he could draw upon in his recovery to move forward. Very well liked by his peers, very funny guy, had a very supportive and involved brother who had been on the scene for many years. And he could tell you what, you know, when he was feeling well enough, what did he like to do? How did he like to spend his time? He loved music, he loved Chinese restaurants and culture, but especially in recent times, his experience of feeling pretty confused and sometimes fearful of others was pretty distressing to him. And at the time that we encountered this story and Jerry, he was essentially not leaving the group home other than once a week to come meet me over at the mental health center for therapy. And he was feeling incredibly lonely, like he wasn't getting out of the house to do much of anything. He wasn't sure if this had something to do with his medication side effects or just the tremendous amount of stress that he was under when his voices were very active. So he was very clear that he wanted to start dating. More than anything, he wanted to have a girlfriend. But at the same time, he was pretty terrified to kind of get out in the community and start dating. It had been 10 years since he had really been on the dating scene. And he was afraid to go out and about in the community on his own and struggled with practical things around kind of just, again, mobility, getting around, getting downtown and taking the bus, right? So keeping that backdrop in mind, actually, let me come up for 1 second. A traditional treatment plan for Jerry very quickly could devolve to goal number 1, medication compliance. Goal number 2, increase insight and reality testing. Goal number 3, achieve and maintain clinical stability. So we have an opportunity to do something very different in the co-creation of a person-centered plan. So we will spend a little bit of time this afternoon going through each of these components and illustrating what they might look like with Jerry. But before we do that, a couple of words are necessary about the critical nature of that person-centered assessment and conversation that has to inform the plan, because you have to gather a different kind of data and a different kind of understanding before you can create a good quality plan. So just a reminder, strengths-based assessment, person-centered assessment and conversation could be an entire webinar unto itself and often is. But for the sake of today's training, just keeping in mind that we have to really be thinking about expanding how we're looking at strengths and interests, thinking about cultural preferences and treatment implications, and not just demographics and identification. But if someone is a 30-year-old Latin man receiving services, how does that impact the providers he wants to work with, the kinds of goals he wants to set in his life? So we want to be looking at treatment implications and preferences, and then also readiness for change. So how much does the person feel ready to tackle at the current point in time, right? So when we're thinking about this, and when we think about what it means to be person-centered, we often use the phrase, well, of course we do that. We meet people where they're at, and we often use that phrase a lot in service settings. But the truth is, if Amanda and I are reading 100 plans a month, 90% of those plans get written as if a person is really sort of deeply at that action stage of change and ready to sort of dive in, right? And sometimes it's too much, too fast. So we're going to be talking a little bit about, sort of how do you follow the person's lead when you co-create that plan. And then lastly, in terms of the assessment and the conversation, we want you to really be thinking about the importance of sort of the bridge between the assessment and the good person-centered plan. And that's what some of you may refer to that as a biopsychosocial summary, a formulation, an integrated summary. It doesn't matter what you call it. We just want to make sure that you see the value in it, right? And the value in it is you don't just want to repeat the data. You want to make sense of it, and you really want to think about how does it then inform an individualized, tailored plan. So if you have an individual that you're supporting, and say, for example, they're having significant medical issues, but they're not attending doctor's appointments, right? We don't want to just sort of repeat and say they're non-compliant with medical care. We have to dig deeper to write a good plan and say, well, what is going on there? So a person may need a bus token because they don't have money for transportation to actually get there. They may get completely overwhelmed or disorganized by symptoms of their mental health experiences. So maybe they're actually forgetting. So then maybe you need some rehabilitation strategies or cognitive remediation. Or maybe you're supporting someone who's a trauma survivor, and maybe they experienced betrayal and violation by an adult male authority figure when they were younger. And their current doctor is a man, and they're terrified to be behind closed doors, right, on their own. So then you have to be thinking about, can we get the nurse to stay in the room? Can we think about advocating for a female practitioner? Talking with the person about what is the reason behind the struggle, and how can we write a better plan to help you move forward? So from a big picture perspective, before we look at the components, you may have noticed in the rectangle graphic that I shared just a couple of minutes ago that traditional treatment plans most often are organized around the problem list, which is the model that you see on the left. So we tend to do the assessment, we identify the problems, and then we just tag a goal for every problem. And you can see how pretty quickly that version of the plan on the left becomes pathologizing. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't get very excited about working that plan in my recovery because I don't see anything in it that's about me and what my vision is. A good quality person-centered plan fundamentally is organized and flows from a vision of recovery and a goal that is owned by the individual. So we're going to walk through each of these elements, but I've tried to give you a quick preview on this right-hand side of the list here, that we can do that in a way and have goals that, you know, start where the person is at, and I want my job back so I can provide for my kids. And that doesn't mean that we're neglecting the significant mental health or substance use related issues that may be getting in the way. We're just addressing them insofar as how they get in the way of that valued recovery goal. Okay, so in case there's any doubt, we wanted to throw our graphics in there. So at this point, I'm going to pass it on over to Amanda, and she's going to start walking us through the components.
Great, thank you. So to build on everything that we've been talking about, what's important to you, same kind of things that are important to everyone. Let's take this old word that we're all feel like we're familiar with, we use all the time. It's the word goal. And let's redefine it. So this is the plan component that is the foundation of the rest of the plan. It's also the plan component that we are redefining what it means. And so this is the part of what's typically a 2-day workshop, where if I can get people being like, this is radical, wait, hold on, wait, what are you saying? I know I'm doing my job. I know people are paying attention. So let's see if we can get your attention with what we're saying a goal is, because we use the word all the time. So let's see what you think about this. It may or may not jive with how you're being trained to fill out the paperwork at your organization. So let's see. So we really want the recovery planning process, whether it, be selecting services, talking about somebody's, future, all of the things that matter and go into the recovery planning process. We really want the essence of it to be about hope, about building hope, right, for that person's life. And there are all these definitions out there, and there's one that emerged for me years ago as we were talking about what is person-centered planning. And this is what came out of my mouth, and I've been saying it ever since. We can't know what a person needs until we first understand what it is that they want, right? And that's what Janice was just talking about. There's this, linear process where we're supposed to identify all these needs that someone has before we ever even ask them, hey, what do you actually want, right? And so that's where we're flipping everything around. How do we best support people when identifying the kind of life that they want to have? And there are all sorts of great little phrases and quotes that I believe originate from the peer movement, the recovery movement by peer professionals, right? A life worth living, a quality life in the community of my choosing, things like that. And so we really want to assist a person when we're supporting them in creating a recovery plan, especially one that we hope other providers are going to read and do something with, is a goal statement about what they want to move toward, what they want, right? And so this concept of, and this should look familiar to a lot of you because it's another version of what you did at the beginning of this session, right? Important to versus important for. It's a very fundamental concept in the world of person-centered thinking and person-centered planning. It really distinguishes between two types of needs that we as human beings have. And they're both important. They both have a place in conversation and in planning and in the documentation. But as Janice talked about earlier, and I think as we all know, those of us who've worked within the traditional healthcare system, we tend to focus a lot on the important 4 things. And we tend to prioritize those a lot when we're supporting other people. And those important 2 items kind of get, put in the parking lot or, kind of put up on a shelf. And really, I've come to believe very strongly that it should be the other way around. And I know that that's certainly true in my life. When I am connected to what motivates me and inspires me, I am much more likely to take care of those must-dos, those have-tos, right? I really need something to get me out of bed in the morning. So what we would really like to see is that every plan, every service plan, every treatment plan, whether it's called a recovery plan and meant to be person-centered or not, has a field titled goal. And my vision of a behavioral health system that is person-centered uses that field for what the person wants, what is important to them. So those goals are 100% owned by the person. And then supporters, professional supporters, it becomes our role to understand and to capture that in a way that the person endorses. Yeah, those are my words, preferably as a quote, right? If the person is okay with it. And then that goal actually guides the rest of the supporters, the treatment team, our actions, right? The services, the rest of the plan. That's my vision. I don't think we're quite there yet, but that's the model that we're trying to get to. And that goal is really about a life in the community. Remember, it's about what's wanted, not necessarily about what's going wrong. We care about that too. We want to capture that information too. But again, what is wanted? What do they want to move toward? In other words, what's going to be the reward for the hard work of recovery? And it really reflects, again, that hope that we have and the high expectations that we have for people. So the types of recovery statements and goals that reflect this type of information look very different, right? It's things like, I want to get my kids back. I want to be a mechanic. I want a girlfriend. I want to have my own place to live. One of my friends and colleagues talked about how she identified she wanted to swim with the turtles in Hawaii, right? It gives you a picture of a quality life worth living that isn't connected to a bunch of stuff you have to do. It's stuff that you want to do, right? And so one last parting proposition here about goals is that we really have to make time to have a conversation with the person. We can't take the information that someone gives us initially at face value, right? Because it's our role, it's not our role to judge, what motivates them, what gives their life meaning. It's our role to understand. And it's our responsibility to seek that understanding. And it's our job to facilitate a conversation using our best judgment for when and how it's appropriate. And to show respect and genuine interest in what that person values. And I want to acknowledge too, and I think this can be great for when we have a little bit more time, or maybe if you have a little bit more time, if you're in a consultation group or if you're doing supervision, it's a great topic for conversation of how do you get at that? How do you initiate conversation with people? Maybe that leads to deeper understanding on your part as a supporter, or maybe that leads to a process of self-discovery if the person that you're supporting may not know exactly what they're moving toward. They may be so oriented to what they don't want, they can't tell you what they do. And that's okay too, right? Or sometimes, you know, what people want changes over time, and that's certainly okay too. I know oftentimes when you ask somebody what they want, they will immediately tell you what they're trying to move away from. And that is very useful information, but it's not a goal. They're telling you about their barriers. And that goes in another section of the plan. And typically, I want to make a little time for that, right? I want to say, that sounds really hard. Tell me more about that. Tell me how that gets in your way, right? But then at some point, I want to bring the conversation back around to, let's talk a little bit about how your life is going to look different once that's no longer a problem. We need to always go back and have the conversation. There was a peer professional in a workshop years ago that just kept saying, have the conversation, you know? So we wanted to show this one more slide to honor the have the conversation message. And so however we choose to start the conversation about a life worth living, AKA goal, right? Maybe we start the conversation with, hey, what are your hopes and dreams for the future? And we've got 4 example initial responses that you might hear from the individual on the left. Let me give you a minute to look over what those initial responses might be. Sorry, the font got a little small here. We couldn't pick and choose our favorites. And imagine how you might continue the conversation without changing it to immediately offer services, start problem solving, asking about barriers, because we find that that's what often happens. When you intend to talk about what someone wants, you end up way over here talking about services or talking about the problems or what I can do for you, right? Rather than really seeking an understanding about what it is that the person wants. And then you'll get these slides later on. But here are some of our suggestions for how you might continue the conversation, keeping the focus on goals and the life that the person does want for their future. And again, this I think is a great topic for a consultation session, supervision session, or some more follow-up discussion. Yeah. There's a great comment in the chat about people who do not necessarily have full decision-making authority over their life, right? Maybe because they've been court ordered, or oftentimes maybe it's because they're a minor, right? Their parents are making their decisions for them. Maybe they're on probation or parole, right? I still think that you can get the person's vision of what they want and link it, right? Like link that to the other decision-making authorities' directives. Does that make sense? And I think that we could unpack that with a little bit more time as we move through, right? The different components. So what we've done a lot of times is the person, you know, wants a house of their own, and you may identify, well, as long as you've got this criminal charge, that's probably going to continue to be a barrier, right? Do you think that we could help you take care of these criminal charges, and that would help you move closer to your goal of getting your own place? And so dealing with the criminal charges, adhering to the court order, that becomes more of a short-term goal, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and more of a barrier than it does that big recovery goal. Does that make sense? I think we can come back to that as another question at the end when we go through. Yeah. And that's another reason why to really make the person's recovery goal kind of be the umbrella and everything else falls under it. The person's vision of the life worth living is the priority. It's the top thing. And then everything else, even the judge's orders, all get filed underneath that. And that's kind of the way that we want to organize the information. Okay,
Thanks,
so
Amanda.
we want to finish up. Yeah, we want to finish up this section on goals with a poll that invites you to think back about Jerry, who Janice introduced us to. And you don't even have to remember everything you learned about Jerry. You can just think about our definition of goal on a person-centered plan. Christine, if you would launch our poll, and we invite you to look at these options based on what we're talking about as the best goal statement. What would you like to see identified on Jerry's plan as the goal statement in terms of something to work toward that would really help to define what everything else on the plan gets oriented to, the umbrella under which everything else kind of gets filed. Remember, it's really all about hope and motivation for Jerry. The thing that gets him out of bed in the morning. Think back to what Janice was talking about. When he sees it on the plan, it should be motivating to him. Like, oh yeah, I remember why I'm working so hard at this. I remember why I'm walking down here to meet up with Dr. Tondora, even after I missed my bus on this rainy day on a Tuesday afternoon. Like, oh, I remember now why I'm doing this. So we'll give everybody a couple more minutes to weigh in. Okay, I think we've got our responses. So let's see. Yay! I want a girlfriend, someone to share my life with was our winner. Right under that was I just want to be happy. So both of these I think are strong because they're Jerry's words. But I think that I want a girlfriend, someone to share my life with is the strongest because it really gives you a vision of what Jerry wants. So if Jerry's initial response to me would have been, I just want to be happy, my follow-up would have been like, can you tell me more about what that looks like? Right? Like, what does happiness look like to you? Because what makes you happy isn't what makes me happy, right? So can you tell me a little bit more, right? So I know how to support you in getting what you want. So it doesn't necessarily have to be smart and meet all the specifics of being measurable, but we need to have enough of an understanding so that it guides the rest of the plan. So great. We're going to move on, and Janice is going to tell us a little bit about the importance of strengths and barriers.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. So if you're thinking about our logic model, Amanda's just walked through with us the different strategies, how to join with someone in conversation to have that sense of that larger recovery vision, what's going to be most motivating for them. And then the next questions that we really want to be asking is thinking about what interests, talents, strengths, what can you draw upon to help you move toward that vision of recovery that's so important to you, while also at the same time not neglecting the fact that there may be some things that are getting in your way that we have to talk about. So let me just give you a couple of quick tips and examples on this before we shift back on over into talking about other components of the plan, like those short-term goals and objectives. So in terms of the role of the strength in the plan, they do identify all those different aspects of a person's life that give them fuel for their recovery journey, fuel for the hard work, as Amanda was saying. And they communicate a message of hope and confidence and value of the person's abilities, because These can be very wide ranging. We always suggest cast the net broad because you never know how a strength is going to be able to be capitalized on and used in a really meaningful way in the plan. So these can vary everything from personal traits and characteristics, whether it's compassion, hard work, motivation, good listener. It could be the thing that I'm most proud of in life, my significant achievements, but it can also be things that exist outside the individual, and those strengths and talents and resources can be found in their different community activities and interests and what they're participating in. They can be found in the strength that they take from cultural traditions and connections. So what we're trying to really encourage you to think about here is that as much as possible, really try to specify to that individual and paint that picture of what the strengths look like for them, not in a generic sense, and also not defaulting to what we sometimes see ends up in that field, right? Strengths about, being medication compliant, adheres to treatment, has insight into illness. Using meds effectively, using treatment effectively, certainly those can help people move forward. But what we're talking about here is a different type of value added. So once you have done the hard work to have the conversation and you've identified what those kind of, I call them golden gems about a person, then we have to really be thinking about what do you do with them? For me, one of the biggest tragedies when I look at, person-centered recovery planning and supporting teams in actualizing that together is that sometimes I will see a staff member doing beautiful strengths-based interviewing and exploration, holding onto hope for a person when they may have lost it for themselves, and identifying a really wide, rich, diverse set of strengths. But yet when we move over to the content of the plan itself, those things are not actually reflected anywhere in the plan documentation. So what I've tried to just identify for you up here are a couple of different examples that show what that might look like and how we might actually capitalize on the strengths that we're assessing in our conversations and our interviews. And it can be everything from a person where spirituality is a cornerstone of their recovery and a source of strength. And if they're struggling with thoughts of suicide, yes, there are clinical services that we can offer to them, but also they might really want spiritual direction from someone in their spiritual community. Or you might be somebody like me who tried to get in shape for 10 years with my New Year's resolution going out the window by January 15th because I had become a couch potato and I wouldn't move forward for that goal for myself. But I was a huge, huge animal lover and I'd always wanted a family dog. The day that I convinced my husband to get that puppy was the day I got myself out of the house and started walking around the block, right? I wouldn't do it for myself, but I was doing it for the puppy. So these things seem simple, but for me at least, that simple first step, drawing on a strength and something that was important to me, touched off a much more significant, focus on my health and wellness and being able to prioritize that. So not just the identification of the strengths, but also how we use them in the plan. And then also, of course, not neglecting the fact that we're continuing to balance that with the reality that there can be different kinds of barriers that are getting in the person's way of the long-term goal. So asking questions like, why can't the person go out and achieve it tomorrow? And what prevents them from doing it? And why can't they do it on their own? With a particular focus on how their experience of mental health challenges might interfere. So in terms of how you're including them in your documentation, I would suggest that the examples on the left are pretty weak examples. They're pretty generic. We don't have a sense of what that looks like for a person. Whereas in the right, instead of just saying anger issues, we're talking about difficulties in their apartment because they're having conflicts with neighbors. We're not just talking about depression. We're talking about the fact that, they're so severely depressed right now that they can't get out of bed to do basic sort of household maintenance. Maybe they're not going to pass their housing inspection if they have a housing voucher and that's coming up. And the importance of documenting with descriptive detail your barriers, there's a variety of reasons for it. And certainly it helps to justify the kinds of services that we're providing in behavioral health system. But at the same time, also, the descriptive barriers connect the dots back to the goal for the person, right? So if you look at those examples on the right, this was from a person who, more than anything, they wanted to keep their own apartment, okay? And so I'm not just talking to you as your therapist about your anger issues and your depression, because that's what I get paid to do. I'm bringing these things up because they're the things that are getting in the way of what you have told me is your number one priority goal in your recovery. So there's a variety of different benefits to having the descriptive detail in there. The last thing what I would say, because it's a really nice segue for Amanda, is that the more descriptive that you are about how something is interfering with a person's life, you're going to be able to write much better tailored objectives and interventions and co-create those with the person in the documentation. So at that point, I'm going to pass it back to Amanda.
Okay, great. Thanks, Janice. So, okay, next up is what we're calling here short-term goals or objectives. So this may satisfy what you had known as goals, right? So we redefine goals, and now we're introducing a plan component that we're referring to as short-term goals or objectives. And as I go through, I'm going to default to objectives now, but know that language doesn't matter. The title of it doesn't matter as much as you need to have something in the plan that serves this function, okay? This plan component tends to be the most challenging. I think you'll understand why for somebody that's writing these plans. So we have included more information in the slides than what we're going to have time to go over. So I'll make sure you know what's in here and that you're leaving with a few key points. For the sake of being really explicit and really straightforward here, I want you to put aside anything that you currently are holding on to related to the terms goals and objectives for just a minute. And I want to talk about progress. I want to talk about progress and results. And we're going to go back to documentation in a minute. And I think that you'll understand why. So how do we know when we're making progress? I've done a lot of clinical supervision with social workers, and I've done a lot of coaching around person-centered recovery planning. And I would say that almost always, if I'm speaking to a professional, speaking to some kind of provider, and I ask, are you making progress with this person? Tell me why or why not. How do you know? They always have an answer that feels very meaningful. They have a sense of like what the person wants and how things are going. They're having conversations that are meaningful, but something breaks down when you try to get it in the documentation and you're trying to meet program standards and things like that. So we have to find a way to talk about measuring progress for the people that we're supporting that is straightforward, it's practical, and it's meaningful. And I think that those of us that have chosen the right line of work, right? We have a sense of this. We have a sense of, you know, what people want and how they're doing, okay? So let's just remind ourselves about why talking about results and outcomes matters. Just in conversation when we're talking to people about their recovery, right? When we talk to people about what they can expect, as in terms of improvement and how their lives are going to improve, it really makes that explicit connection between the potential action steps that they're about to take, whether those be formal services or deciding to get a new dog and walk it every day, like Janice just started talking about, right? And the way that it's going to make their life better. in ways that they care about, right? It really makes that explicit connection between cause and effect, right? What can I commit to right now, and how is it going to benefit me? And by making that connection explicit, it's really going to support people's motivation and engagement. And by supporting people's motivation and engagement, it builds momentum toward the longer term recovery goal, the longer term life that they want. I think it also demonstrates accountability for us professionals, right? Because I think there's a lot of recommendations, there's a lot of paperwork that we have to do. And for me, as a clinical social worker, if I'm taking the time to connect the dots between, my treatment recommendations or the actions that we've talked about, and what I see is the potential benefits to that individual that's sitting right in front of me, it's really going to demonstrate that I have a level of accountability for the program and the work that I'm doing. And I think that people pick up on that, and that really is something that is often missing, right? When people meet with their professionals. So I think talking about results is a really big, important part of the work that we do with people. So now let's take this whole idea of talking about results and think a little bit more in terms of writing objectives or short-term goals or whatever you want to call these things that are on the plans, right? Think of this as a checklist of the function of the objectives, okay? Objectives serve as the anticipated results that are going to be meaningful to the person once they're achieved, right? So they haven't happened yet. The person isn't going to start doing it that day. It's something that's going to happen, right? Remember, it's that cause and effect relationship. It's an effect that hasn't happened yet. Another way to think about objectives is it's a description of concrete changes in a person's behavior that's expected to happen once immediate barriers are overcome. And this is another really great tip to writing strong objectives, is you really want to see that strong connection to the barrier that the person is most struggling with. When there's a strong connection to the functional barriers that somebody's encountering, then that objective is going to matter to the person, and it's also going to be a great way to measure progress. Another way to think about objectives is it's proof when the person is meeting those objectives over time that the action steps they're taking, whether the action steps be personal wellness strategies or professional services, are actually helping them and are well matched to their needs. Objectives must be developed with the person. They don't have to be written by the person. You don't have to ever use the word objective. In fact, I would recommend against it. But when they read their plan, they need to say, oh yeah, I remember having that conversation. Yeah, we talked about that. That makes sense to me, right? And then the last thing here is, and I hope that you cheer a little cheer of, celebration here. A lot of plans are way too long to be useful. And so Janice and I think, enjoy making this recommendation. Beware of putting too many objectives and too many goals, for that matter, on a plan. The best plans that I've seen have one meaningful goal and around 3 really meaningful objectives, because really that's about as much as any one person can focus on at any given time. I don't know about you all, but on a good day, I have a hard time maintaining where I am right now. The idea of making more than 3 meaningful changes is way too much for me. And I think that that's probably true for a lot of people. Okay, I want to make a few other points about objectives without diving in too deep. If you are not with me right now, put something in the chat box. So I just want to reiterate a point. A lot of people talk about SMART goals. And in this case, we're talking about SMART objectives, okay? So I'm going to get to that slide here in just a minute. Here's something I think that's really interesting. And if you all want to attend the TA session that is connected to this webinar, I think this would be a good thing for us to talk a little bit more about. There's also a fantastic video by the Hearing Voices Network that really helps to drive home this point. It is a huge myth that getting rid of symptoms is the best way to measure progress. And we see that all the time, that symptom reduction is like the best way to measure progress. It's a measurement, and for many people, it will be meaningful, but oftentimes people learn to live with experiences that we label as symptoms instead of getting rid of them altogether. And in our more traditional model or system of care, continuously measuring progress only by asking people if they're still hearing voices or still seeing things that other people aren't seeing has led oftentimes to over medicating people. And that can be just as harmful as those symptoms or experiences are themselves, right? So to be continued, if you're interested in that topic, I think it's a great one to have. We wanted to offer up a variety of great example objectives because there tends to be a formula that makes a strong objective. So we wanted to give a variety of examples. I'm not going to read all of these. I'm going to read the first one and then we're going to move on. You'll kind of get a sense of the anatomy of an objective. So the first one reads, Philip will have increased social interaction as evidenced by meeting a friend for coffee at Dunkin' Donuts at least 3 times over the next 30 days. So you're kind of picking up, like we can get a sense of like what the barrier is, what's the behavioral change. There's like a certain amount of time that we're expecting it might take for the behavioral change to happen, right? So again, rather than talking about SMART goals, we're talking about SMART short-term goals or SMART objectives. So there is still something measurable outcomes in the plan, but we're doing it at the level of the objectives so that the person who's being supported can own the goal 100%. And we're not negotiating that ownership away from them and making it about treatment outcomes, because objectives tend to capture more about treatment outcomes and they're still meaningful to the person, but they tend to incorporate more of like the outcomes and the impact of our programs and services. And this is where, by the way, just to come back to the person's question and comment about court-ordered services, this would be where you might see reference to, like, if the person, restoration of competency, somebody who's incompetent to stand trial, you might see an objective of like, you know, we're going to restore competency as ordered by the court. You might see one objective that was really to satisfy someone else other than the person because it was court ordered, right? Rather than that taking over the plan by putting it as the goal. And we can talk more about that at the TA session if you are able to attend that. So this slide is here. We're not going to spend time unpacking it, but it takes a couple of the examples and then kind of breaks down the anatomy of an objective by naming the different parts that are in there and giving some technical tips for crafting objectives. And I see some people in the chat that are saying they want to attend the TA session. That's exciting to me. You're going to get a follow-up email There is some preference given to certain regions, but everyone who wants to attend should be able to request attendance. And Janice and I are going to do our best to accommodate everybody who wants to be there, because we know this is a very short amount of time to tackle some of this information. This is the last slide I have on objectives, and it's a personal sort of mission for me. If I could change one concrete thing about objectives throughout the system, it would be to institute this one concrete rule. We cannot have objectives that are simply about measuring people's service participation. If objectives are about progress, we can't measure people's progress by simply measuring if they're showing up for services. That's not good enough, right? And so when I see plans that simply have Wanda's going to attend the group every twice a week, I say, well, that's a service. How is attending that service going to benefit Wanda's life? That's the objective, right? Again, that cause and effect relationship. And so maybe the objective for Wanda would read something like what's on the right. Wanda will apply mindfulness techniques to decrease the frequency of self-injury to no more than one instance per week within the next 90 days, something like that. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information on a really complex skill, but based on what you've heard, let's go back to Jerry. And Christine, if you can launch that poll for us. Let's see, of the 5 options, what do you think would be the strongest objective on Jerry's plan? Remember, we are looking for SMART criteria. We're looking for a meaningful, real life outcome for Jerry. Oh, this makes me happy. We've got a clear winner here. All right, I think you can go ahead and share the results. Yes, the second option is definitely the strongest one. So Jerry will participate in at least 6 community activities that he chooses in the next 60 days. Because we remember that he wasn't able to get out into the community. That was a big barrier for him. So if he's able to go out 6 times in the next 60 days, we're going to know that something's getting better. All right, we can stop sharing that. Excellent. Okay, Janice is going to make some important distinctions with how we identify action steps, services or otherwise, on the PCRP.
Great. All right, so as we transition here, I think maybe a simple way to think about the distinction between that short-term goal or objective, and then our interventions, services, methods, action steps, you may call them different things, is that short-term goal or objective, that is what the person wants to achieve or do differently in their life. Whereas the services and other action steps really talk about how the whole team is going to work together to help the person get there. So just a couple of quick thoughts on these, because in the person-centered world, you may see different kinds of action steps on plans that you're not necessarily used to seeing. Typically, what we will have are service plans that are dominated sometimes exclusively just by professional billable services. But in this logic model of maximizing the person-centeredness of plans, we also want to consider what we call personal action steps or natural supporter action steps, if the person or family chooses to have natural supports involved. So this slide just gives you a couple of reminders around the kinds of things we're talking about as it relates to the professional services that we have in plans, right? Like every aspect of the plan, we should still be respecting individual choice and preference. You may see a variety of evidence-based services emerge in your action step section, but also alternative, innovative, recovery-oriented services or culturally informed, faith-based alternative strategies that a person may want to use. And in terms of how you actually document them, you want to make sure that they're highly individualized and specific to that person and their particular desired results, that phrase Amanda kept using. So just in terms of a method or a model for how you think about the components of an intervention or an action step, a professional intervention, you want to think about these critical W's. You want to know who is actually providing the service, name or job title, if in fact you can specify that. We recognize that in some types of program models, you may have a variety of people on a team, like assertive community treatment, for example, it may be a different person. But if it's always the team nurse, you want to identify that, because this section of the plan is a tool of accountability. Who can the person go to for what? So who's providing the service? What exactly is it? On what schedule and why? You want to say just a little bit about the individualized intent and purpose. So we've tried to give you a variety of examples up here on the screen, just to take one of them. If we take that middle one, you may have a rehabilitation specialist providing some community integration support once a week for 6 months to coach and practice skills necessary to be able to get around using the Access community system, okay? So a quick shout out, you notice we have a peer specialist intervention on the bottom of the screen here, and a lot of questions can come up around where and how we're actually incorporating peer specialist interventions into the documentation, but very critically doing it in a way that stays aligned with peer values and ethics. So just a reminder, that's going to be the topic of our May 15th webinar. And lastly, on the intervention section, this is the piece that may be new for some of you. In addition to the variety of professional services you're adding, we're going to encourage you to be thinking about these personal action steps. What can a person do right now, tapping back into their strengths, what they knew works for them in their daily wellness? What can they do to add to this plan? It builds a sense of self-agency. And we'll give you a few examples in a minute of what they might look like. What we don't want them to look like is we don't want them to be a simple flip of the intervention, the professional intervention you just added. So if you have an intervention around Janice Tondora is providing social skills group, you don't want in the personal action step to be that the person is going to attend Janice's group, right? There's no value added in that. You want to write them in a way that you get some value added. Similarly, if a person chooses to have a friend, a family member, a neighbor, I've even seen a mailman one time involved in a recovery plan, focusing on adding a natural support action to the plan is an important opportunity to build that natural circle of support that can help sustain the person's recovery over time, right? So it decreases some of that reliance on professional services and promotes growth and transition. In case any of you are worrying about this, I often get asked the question, but what if we put something on the plan and the mother doesn't follow through or the neighbor doesn't follow through? You're not on the hook for that natural support action. That will be clear. You're only responsible for follow through on your professional services that you're documenting. So nonetheless, even though you can't necessarily control the natural support actions, they have such critical utility in the plan, we want to encourage you to think about including them. So on the left here, you just have an example of some of the personal self-directed actions, like Elaine on the bottom left. You know, maybe Elaine is someone who loves to read and loves the computer and is feeling pretty seriously depressed and doesn't have a lot of hopefulness. So maybe you're helping Elaine tap into and find first-person recovery narratives that they're listening to online. On the right-hand side, you may have someone that more than anything, they want to get back to the faith community of their choice. And you could be offering a variety of professional interventions to help them get there and feel more comfortable in that setting, but they also need to physically get there. And could we potentially reach out to someone in that faith community to arrange a ride to Sunday services? So just trying to give you examples of how these different types of action steps work together in synergy to help the person move forward. So the last thing we're going to do, this is Christine's cue to open our last poll, which is going to be around which do you think would be the best intervention or action steps to support Jerry around his objective of getting more active in the community. This one you can do multiple choice, and that's intentional, right? Because there's different kinds of valuable action steps to add to a plan. So go ahead and vote, and we'll see where we land. Few more seconds here if you want to get a last minute vote in. All right, Christine, you can go ahead and end and share the results there. So again, we have two clear winners. You can see from the multiple choice perspective, we've got a really nice example of a professionally delivered intervention or action step around number 2 with the rehab specialist doing some travel training. But at the same time, we want to maximize the value of someone like Jerry's brother, Jim, getting alongside him and help him to feel more comfortable on some of those community outings that he's working on. So we don't have time for us to go over this in its entirety, and it will be in the copy of the slides that you get. But the reason we like to provide a sample at the end is just to hopefully show you how you can weave together a person-centered recovery plan that starts with what is most critical to the person, most motivating, and stay true to that vision, while at the same time not neglecting some significant barriers or assessed needs, which might be interfering with them being able to move forward. So together, we have actually built this plan today throughout the polls. A copy of it will be in your slides, just for future reference. I think just a takeaway picture is that we've mentioned this concept before, that people don't believe that honoring the person and medical necessity can exist peacefully and coexist in a good quality plan. So again, hopefully what we've shared today gives you some optimism that that is actually possible. We're going to give you a wide variety of resources and encourage you to check them out. This particular slide has links that will be available to you when you get the slides, and I have a feeling some of my colleagues are dropping them into the chat box as we speak. It includes a really nice tip sheet on the bottom left developed by Amanda around how you create with an individual really meaningful short-term objectives that are about desired results and maintaining all of your SMART criteria along the way, as well as on the bottom right, a variety of tip sheets that get at the concrete indicators of what does a good plan look like, the recovery roadmap indicators. Lastly, I would say that we value your feedback, and we would appreciate it very much if you would complete our evaluation. We use that data to design what we do moving forward. And we only have about a minute left. We saw a couple of questions come into the chat that we paused to take, but I'm just going to ask Amanda or Christine, does anyone see anything? Or if you want to put something into the chat, we'll take a quick look.
There's no doubt that we missed something along the way, but I don't see anything from recently. I do hope that many of you can join us for the TA session, and I saw some back and forth about how to access that. So I think there are some accommodation yeah, that if you did register for this one, regardless of the region in which you live, that you will get the opportunity to request attending that one. And we will do
Amanda and
our
I
best.
We're
We will
trying
do
to
our best.
model what we're teaching and to be responsive to your needs. And if we need to flex and offer more than one TA session, we will put our heads together if this is a topic of high demand you need some more support with.
Yeah, or do breakout rooms so that there's
Yep.
a little bit more smaller, like, so we can slow down. Yes, Sammy, like
Yeah.
we're trying to like cover stuff, but then that our vision of the TA sessions is that we can slow down and do a little bit more rich back and forth and application for people, so it won't be as didactic or as fast paced. So that's our goal for the TA session.
Thanks, Amanda. That's
Thank
a great
you for your time.
Yeah, thank you for
Yeah.
your time. Please watch your email for post-training communications and materials. It will include copy of the slides, a link to our remaining sessions, CEU information, and additional detail around technical assistance sessions.
Thanks for the note, Alicia. We'll check out the resources to make sure there aren't redundant links in there.
Yep.
We were creating some of that right up until the time, so we may have made a mistake there. So we'll make sure we correct that if needed. Thanks, everybody.
Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thanks for being with us.